Did you pick up New Look 6712? If so, you're in luck because today I'm going to show you how you can take this pattern and hack it into this adorable two-piece set. Today we're focusing on the top, which features a tie collar and a scalloped edge hem. And in the next video, I'll show you how to make the shorts. You'll need pattern piece number 1, the front, and you'll add a 1/2 inch to the hemline. You'll need pattern piece number 2, the back, and you'll add 1/2 inch to the hemline to this piece also. Pattern piece number 3, the back yoke. This one stays as is. And pattern piece number 4, the collar. We are going to be extending this piece into a tie. So starting off with pattern piece number 1, we are going to go ahead and add the 1/2 inch seam allowance to the bottom of the hem. And I'm taking my ruler, lining it up with the line, and marking off my 1/2 inch. And you're going to repeat this all the way down. And if you are newer to sewing, as you're nearing the side seam, if you're using one of the smaller sizes, as you're tracing and adding your seam allowance, make sure that you are lining your ruler up with the line of the correct size that you're using. I'm adding my seam allowance to the 18, and I'm using that line to line up on my ruler to add the 1/2 inch seam allowance. But if you're using, like, let's say the size 16 or the 14, you're going to line it up with that dashed line for the pattern and then mark out your seam allowance from there. But since I am using the size 18, I'm going to start my line at the very end and mark my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And repeat that process on your back piece, pattern piece number 2. And for the last modification on pattern piece number 4, the collar. So we're going to keep the center front as is. You're still going to cut that piece on fold. What would be the center back seam, you are going to extend it out long enough to make ties. So depending on how long you want your tie to be or how big you want your bow, I'm going to do this fairly long just so that way I can get a tie that's long enough to where I can either tie it in the back as a bow or wrap it around my neck to the side or the front and make a big bow. It'll be anywhere between 30 and 34 inches long. So I'm left this little extension on the paper just to remind myself to extend it out when it's on the fabric. But I'm doing this only because I don't have any tracing paper to make the actual pattern piece, but I will be showing you what it looks like on the fabric. I'll also slightly adjust the shape on this piece here at that center back. So go ahead and cut out your fabric. So for pattern piece number 1, you'll need 1 and you'll cut it on fold. Pattern piece number 2, the back, you'll also need 1 of your fabric and you'll cut that on the fold. For pattern piece number 3, the back yoke, you're going to cut 4 of your fabric. And for pattern piece number 4, the collar, you are going to cut 2 on the fold and 1 piece of interfacing on the fold. And to get this shape for the tie, if you notice, it has a slight curve in it. So I just traced the center back end line and made just a slight downward curve for the tie and extended it out. And I'm also going to point out that I cut my interfacing piece in the original shape of the collar and left the extension or the tie piece without interfacing, and you'll just fuse that to one side. Now this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Just make sure that you've transferred all your markings and all your notches. So we're going to go ahead and make these pleats here. So first to the center front, we're going to fold over these pleats and pin them in place. And then the second set of pleats, we're going to go ahead and fold those over and pin them in place as well. And this is on your pattern piece number 1, your front. So once you have those pleats nicely folded over and pinned in place, take it over to your machine, baste those pleats in place, and then while you're also there, you're going to make a row of stay stitching across the front neck edge at 5/8 of an inch. Now grab pattern piece number 2, your back, and you're going to make your inverted box pleats. Now once you have those pleats pinned in place, try to say that 3 times fast. And then take it over to your machine and then baste them down. And once you have your pleats stitched down on both your front and your back piece, you're going to set those off to the side and grab your yoke pieces. On all 4 of your back yoke pieces, that's pattern piece number 3, you're going to put a row of stay stitching across the neckline. So go ahead and do that now at your machine. Once you have that done, join 2 of your back yoke pieces together at the center back, pin in place. Then you're going to stitch from the bottom edge to the dot and back stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Make sure you face them right sides together, and you're going to repeat this on the second set of yoke pieces. Then press your seam allowances open. And from here on out, one set will be your yoke and the other set will be your yoke facing. Go ahead and grab your front piece and place it right side facing up. Then you're going to grab your yoke piece and place it on top, matching the right sides together. Then go ahead and pin it in place at the shoulder, matching your notches, and then baste it in place at 5/8 of an inch. And once you have that yoke piece basted down, you're going to flip your front piece over to the wrong side. And then you're going to grab your back yoke facing piece, place it down with the wrong side facing up, pin it at the shoulders, and then stitch it in place at 5/8 of an inch through all the thicknesses. Go ahead and take it over to your machine and stitch down the shoulder seams. Once you have that done, you're going to go ahead and match your yoke back and your yoke back facing along those opening edges. So match them right sides together at that seam, pin it in place. Then you're going to stitch from the neck edge to the dot at 5/8 of an inch. And once you stitch that seam down, you're going to understitch the seam allowance to the facing piece. I'm going to open this up so you can see it a little better. With the understitching, I only understitched from the neck edge to the dot, so you don't have to understitch all the way down. And once you finish with that, you can press that seam toward the facing. One additional step I'd like to highlight, and I'll show you from the outside, I also understitched at the shoulder seam. You don't have to do this step, but I did it strictly as a preference. So if you'd like to, you can understitch at the shoulder seam and then press that seam toward the facing as well. Or you can totally omit that. It's fine either way. Now you're going to place your front piece facing down with the wrong side of the front facing you. Grab your back piece and you're going to match it right sides together with the bottom edge of your yoke. Make sure you line it up at the center back and then all the way across, matching your notches. And you're only going to pin in place just the yoke piece, leaving the facing free. Then once you pin it in place, take it over to your machine and stitch the yoke piece together with the back edge at 5/8 of an inch, and then press that seam toward your yoke. Go ahead and do that now, and remember, keep that back yoke facing free. And once you have that seam stitched, you're going to take your lower edge of your yoke facing and press under that edge at 1/2 an inch. So go ahead and take this over to your ironing board and press that bottom edge all the way across at 1/2 of an inch. And as an extra tip, you can mark with tailor's chalk your 1/2 inch before you press it, just so that way you have a clear line. And once you have your yoke facing edge pressed, you're going to pin that edge of the facing over the seam. And here's where I'm deviating from the original pattern instructions. I'm placing my pins along the inside to cover the seam, because what I like to do is pin it down to make sure I'm completely covering the seam, and then I'll hand baste it in place. But if you feel more comfortable pinning it along the outside and then stitching in the ditch, go ahead and do that. But if you pin the yoke facing along the seam from the inside and then hand baste it in place, I promise you that when you stitch in the ditch from the outside, you won't miss any of the seam. So however you're comfortable, go ahead and do that, and then turn it over and then stitch in the ditch. Then once you're done there, baste your yoke edges together along the neck and the armhole edges. Be sure to press that yoke seam when you're finished there. If you notice, I've gone ahead and serged the edges of my front and back at the side seams. You can do that before matching them together and joining them, or you can zigzag the edges to keep them from fraying. But whatever method you use to finish off your edges is up to you. But either way, go ahead and match up your front to your back at the side seams, right sides together, and then stitch down at 5/8 of an inch, and then press the seams open. You can also go ahead and serge the edge of your hem, or you can zigzag it. And then we'll set this off to the side and grab your collar pieces. Now we're going to go ahead and open up our collar pieces, and remember, on the one piece with the interfacing, it is going to be in the original shape of the pattern piece. But open up your collar pieces and place them right sides together and then pin them in place. Make sure you're matching up all your dots and notches. Pin all the way around on your collar edge and your tie, and stop on that notch at the bottom edge. Once you have it pinned together, then you're going to stitch from the center front all the way around across the edge of the ties and across the bottom, and stop at the dot. And you're going to stitch from the center front all the way around on both sides. Go ahead and stitch it at 5/8 of an inch and stop on the dot. Once you have your collar stitched together, you're going to trim the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch and trim your corners all the way along the top edge of the outside. And at the bottom, you're going to trim down to the dot. So between your two dots at the bottom edge, make sure you leave your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Don't trim that down. And once you have your seam allowances trimmed, you're going to flip your tie inside out on both sides. And a tip I can give you is you can use a point turner to get it started off, but I do tend to use my yardstick on these longer pieces. So just slow and steady on flipping it inside out. Slow and steady so you don't rip your piece. Then once you have your tie flipped, you're going to take it over to your ironing board and press it flat. And while you're there, on the inside of the collar piece, you're also going to press the seam allowance of the upper edge of the collar toward the piece with the interfacing. And also along the open edge of the seam on the piece with the interfacing, you're going to press the seam allowance up at 1/2 of an inch. I also pressed the seam allowance at 5/8 on the non-interface piece, but that step is totally optional. Now you're going to take your top with the right side up and attach your collar piece to the center front right sides together on the non-interface piece. And you're going to pin it together all the way around from the front to the back edge, making sure you're matching up your notches. And just so you know, this hack is a part of the Hot Girl Summer Challenge hosted by Rochelle of Rochelle Handmade Designs. There's 22 other lovely ladies in the sewing community participating in this challenge. So I'll leave all their information and handles to their channels and Instagrams in the description box below, and be sure to check them out. And as you're pinning, you're going to also want to clip along the top edge of the top itself to the stay stitching, so that way it'll fit to the notches. Make sure you're clipping along the top edge of the blouse only to the stay stitching, and don't clip your collar, and finish pinning. And once you have it pinned in place, you're going to stitch from the center front along the edges at 5/8 of an inch all the way to the center back. Once you have that seam stitched, then press it up toward the collar. Then you're going to take the interface piece of the collar that's pressed up. You're going to take that pressed edge and pin it along the edge of the seam. So pin it all the way around. Now you can pin this along the inside. Then once you have it pinned in place, I recommend going ahead and hand basting it down, covering that seam, and then flip over and stitch in the ditch. But of course, if you don't want to hand baste it, you can always pin it along the outside and then stitch in the ditch. Just again, whatever method you use, just make sure you're covering that seam completely, and then you're catching it along when you stitch in the ditch. So let's go ahead and do that now. One thing I almost forgot to mention, when you go to stitch it in the ditch, I always start a little bit off the edge. That way it catches that little opening to close off the tie completely. I'm going to use some DIY bias binding to bound off my armhole edges. So I'm just going to pin this binding and stitch it around the edges, and then go ahead and flip it over, pin it in place, and stitch in the ditch. Just to keep it simple and to keep it at as few pattern pieces as possible, I chose this method to finish off my armhole. But I'm not opposed to facings for finishing off your armhole seams. So if that's something that you'd like to see in a future tutorial, just let me know down in the comments. Now we're going to jump down to the hem, and we're going to mark up our hem allowance up an inch. Now I'm marking this an inch away from my serged edge. Once you have your hem marked, you're going to fold your hem upward toward the right side of your garment and press it in place. To mark the scalloped edge, I'm using a template that I found off Pinterest, and these scallops are about 2 5/8 inch in width. You're going to take the template and line the edge up with the side seam and then pin it in place. And as I'm pinning it along the edge, I'm leaving about 1/4 of an inch space in between the bottom of the edge and the scallop. Once you have the template pinned, you're going to take either a tailor's chalk or a marking tool and trace the edge of the scallops. When you've reached the edge of the template, lift it up and go ahead and repin it in place. Make sure you line up the last scallop scoop, then continue to trace all the way around the edge of your hem. Once you finish tracing your scallops, you're going to pin down your hem as so. Once you have your hem pinned down, you're going to take it over to your machine and you're going to stitch along those traced lines for the scallops. Make sure you're pivoting your needle at the pointed edge. Do that and come back. And because stitching around the curved lines can be a little tricky, I recommend going slow and steady on this step. But once you have that done, you're going to go ahead and clip into those corners and trim the seam anywhere between that corner inch or of 1/8 of an inch. So just be really careful when you're going through this part. For the corners, you want to clip to, but not through the seam. And around the curved edges of the scallops, just make tiny little clips. Take your time. Remember, to, not through the seam. And on the side seam, just below the serger and where that fold meets over, you're going to trim it down to about 1/4 of an inch on that seam allowance. Now here comes the fun part. So you're going to flip your scallops inside out. And I'm using a rounded off edge of my pointer tool to help me do that. So go ahead and flip out all of those scalloped edges. And then once you've got them flipped to the outside, you're going to take it over to your ironing board and press them out. Now you may have to fiddle with this for a while. This process is a little bit tedious, but take your time, round out those scallops, press them out, and then you're home free. All right, my lovelies, give your top one final press, pat yourself on the back, and you're good to go. If you're ready to tackle the shorts, you can watch that video right here. And if you want to work on your sketching and practice with me, you can watch this video next. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, y'all, keep sketching, keep sewing, and keep the momentum going. Take care.